Ready? Good afternoon or good evening. My name is Paul Fishman. I'm a partner with the law firm of Arnold and Porter, but for much of my career I was in public service with the Justice Department, including as the United States Attorney for the District of New Jersey for almost the entire Obama administration. And my good friend Melanie Gorelick has asked me to moderate this panel on the faith voice in the movement to end mass incarceration. We're joined by a spectacular group of guests. Jason's going, really? Yes, a spectacular group of guests.
And me.
Exactly. No. Anyway, and all of their bios are in the program, so I'm not gonna go through them in detail, but I will introduce them each briefly. We have a lot of territory to cover in 55 minutes. And so we're going to divide this up into little segments. They don't really know that yet, but I've thought about it on the train on the way down. Yeah, exactly. So we're going to start. I'm going to introduce each of them, and each of them is going to talk for 4 or 5 minutes tops about what it is that they do in the criminal justice reform movement and what brought them to that. And then I'm going to ask a series of questions, which will be largely softballs, I hope, except for Jason. No, they'll all be softballs. and to talk about a little bit about the intersection of criminal justice reform and faith generally and what's going on in the country today. So first is the Reverend John Vaughn, who until last week, and still sort of, is the executive vice president of the Auburn Seminary in New York. But as of last Sunday, Groundhog Day, became the executive pastor, which is the chief operating officer, effectively, of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which, as everybody in this room probably knows, is so closely affiliated with Dr. King and is really one of the beacon churches in the civil rights movement. To his right is Jason Flom, who started his career, I think, as a freshman in college in the music business when he probably should have been going to class, and ultimately became quite a success in that business as the head of Atlantic Records and Virgin, and then went back to the company he founded called Lava to continue to do the music business. He's discovered more people than everybody in this room put together by far, but also has a very interesting story of how he came to be unbelievably involved in the criminal justice reform movement, both in terms of opposition to mandatory minimums and ultimately as the founding board member of the Innocence Project. And to his right is Sakira Cook, who is the Criminal Justice Reform Coordinator for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which, as we all know, is the umbrella organization that's now 60 or 70 years old. 70 years old, headed by her boss and my good friend Vanita Gupta, the former head of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And Sakira runs point on all the criminal justice initiatives that the Leadership Conference is putting together. So Reverend, why don't we start with you? Talk a little bit about how you came to this movement and the organization that or the project that you founded on the use of faith in opposition to mass incarceration.
So thanks again. It's good to be here. So Raphael Warnock, the senior pastor at Ebenezer, had a conversation with my then boss, the Reverend Dr. Catherine Henderson, the president at Auburn Seminary. Pastor Warnock actually is an Auburn senior fellow. And they said, I'm interested to do a conference around ending mass incarceration. And one of the things that really concerns me is that we as a faith community haven't found our voice, not in a real powerful, influential way. And so fast forward, I was asked to work with Pastor Warnock and to begin to kind of pull in others to see if we could catalyze a faith-rooted response to mass incarceration. And so we reached out to the Temple, who have been longtime partners with Ebenezer, and then began to reach out to other faith partners, not just in Georgia, but in different parts of the country. And we both pulled off this conference this past summer at Ebenezer that was really focused on bringing together faith communities, but also, lawyers, judges, nonprofits, et cetera. We expected maybe 200 to 300 people. We got 1,000 people from 27 states. It was an exciting experience, but it was really about trying to launch this opportunity for faith communities to work across faith traditions to catalyze a faith-rooted response to mass incarceration. And so I would say the 3 areas, and then I'll close at this point, will be we've created this wonderful faith toolkit with our partners at Public Square Media, who actually did the film that you just saw. There's a longer version that they've created. Judy Doctoroff is here. She's got a table. We've got copies of some of the kits if you're interested around, particularly in terms of how one does expungements. But it's a faith toolkit that helps faith communities try to plug in one way or another into this work. The second is we want to help change the narrative. How do we help shift? We've got a lot of bad theology out there around mass incarceration. And how do we shift the theology and begin to create messages that really will move and will continue to inspire and to unite? And the third part of it is we want to try to support faith communities' engagement around policy, both at the federal level but at the state level. I will say that it's important to us that we're trying not to create brand new stuff. It's how does the faith community add value to great work that's already going on, and how do we continue to center the voices of those that are directly impacted by mass incarceration, so those that have been incarcerated as well as family members and friends.
Okay. Thank you, Reverend. We're going to come back to the question about how, because using faith and relying on faith can be tricky in certain circumstances, as you just alluded to. But before we get to that, let's go completely to the more secular, which is the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, although there are lots of faith-based organizations that are members of that group. But what are you guys up to on the criminal justice reform front now? Because some of the stuff you're doing is very forward-leaning.
Yes, thank you to JCPA for inviting me to come today and talk to you about our work. I am a native Washingtonian. I was born and raised here. And I came to this work on justice reform because it was very personal to me. At the age of 11, I guess that's the earliest memory that I have, I remember going to visit my uncle who was incarcerated in prison in Indiana. My dad was here, his only brother, and he ensured that we maintained a relationship, a familial relationship with his brother who was incarcerated for what he used to say at the time that I now understand, 20-cent piece of rock. Right, which is crack cocaine, which he was selling at the time in a school zone, or was accused of selling in a school zone. And my uncle served, at 12 years old, I became my uncle's pen pal. Because phone rates, right? We all maybe heard about prison phone rates and how it's really expensive for families to maintain communications with their loved ones, so they write or they try to go visit. And so that experience stuck with me, and throughout my matriculation in college and law school, I always had a passion for and an affinity for understanding why our criminal legal system was as discriminatory as it was, and why Black and brown people were overrepresented in that system. And so when I came to the Leadership Conference and I got to work on this issue, it was a moment of transition for the Leadership Conference, in that they hadn't really taken up, and civil rights organizations, quite frankly, hadn't really taken up the issue of criminal justice reform, right? They had been around for driving while Black. You know, we talked about racial profiling a lot, but looking at the broad swath of issues in the criminal legal system, they had stayed away from. And this was pointed out in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, when that came out. And so there was a commitment, I think a renewed commitment after the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act in 2009, to have the coalition and to have the Leadership Conference really tackle this issue in a meaningful way, to understand why we have mass incarceration, and to put forth a vision and a position for reforming the criminal legal system and ending mass incarceration and overcriminalization. And so recently, you know, we've seen some wins over time. We've seen the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act. We've seen most recently the passage of the First Step Act. But what we haven't seen is a full-on tackling of the criminal legal system from the very front-end issues dealing with policing, sentencing, pretrial justice, reentry, prison conditions. And no one has put forth a vision for our community for what it looks like to actually end mass incarceration, right? 2.2 million people in prison. But how do we actually get that down? How do we return back to the day in 1970 where we had some hundreds of thousands of people that were incarcerated in this country. And so we put together this platform and released it in September of 2019. Hopefully you have a copy, but it's online if you don't. A vision for justice that really grounds us in the history of the criminal legal system and how it has its ties to the legacy of enslavement in this country, and how over time that legacy has infiltrated our criminal legal system, and why we have the disparities that we have, and put forth policy recommendations, quite frankly, for how we can reduce that across the continuum, and what people should be thinking about as we think about public safety, right? Because our natural instinct in this country is to go to a retribution type of model, right, where we want to punish everyone for the mistakes that they made, and that has led to where we are today. But this is envisioning something different. It's saying that in order for us to have true safety in this country, we actually have to have the upfront investments in education, in housing, in economic opportunity, and everything that we know creates safe and thriving and healthy communities for everyone. And if we don't have that, we have the disinvestment we've seen in poorer communities and quote unquote minority communities, we will continue to see the rates of incarceration that we see today. And so we really hope, and I'm really excited to have this conversation, that people dig into this policy platform. You're not going to agree with everything in it. It is very forward-looking, right? You're going to be like, ooh, maybe on some things, but I think it challenges you to think critically about where we should be going.
Great. So Jason, your journey to this has been very different than that. So why don't you tell us how you got involved in this work and how meaningful it's become to you and why?
Yeah, I mean, I can't help sitting up here with this great group thinking this feels like this just popped in my head. It's like a pastor, a lawyer, a Jew, and an activist walked in a ballroom, you know what I mean? But I'm thrilled to be up here with you guys and so happy to be here with the JCPA. Hi, JCPA, how's everybody doing out there? I mean, how's everybody doing out there? Oh my God, Jesus, wake up.
And therein lies the cultural divide between the Reverend and you. Right? He would have gotten a totally different response at his congregation.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. I mean, I'm feeling a little put down here. So anyway, I got involved in this stuff in the early 90s just because I read a story in the newspaper about a kid that was serving 15 to life on a nonviolent first offense cocaine possession charge in New York State, a maximum security prison. And make a long story short, I didn't know anything about mandatory sentencing laws. I'd had substance abuse problems as a kid. I ended up in rehab, and I was very cognizant of the fact that had my skin been a different color or had I had lived in a different zip code, the outcome would have been much more grim and sinister. And so, I mean, literally where I lived in New York at that time, like I had hair, like literally I had so much hair that it covered my entire head. There was just a little slot in the middle that I could see through.
I've seen the photo, it's online. It's actually worth looking at.
I had to
really
turn this way to see that way and this way to see that way. And I was always had a joint in my mouth, so sometimes I was on fire, literally. And I remember bumping into a cop because I couldn't see, and he just said, put that out. I was like, oh, good, yeah, sorry. So that was my reality, right? But anyway, so I read this story of this kid named Stephen Lennon, and I just thought, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Like, I had no idea that you could go to prison for that long for a nonviolent first offense. And I decided I had to do something about it. And I didn't know that I couldn't, so I said, fuck it, I'm gonna try. So, long story short, I ended up
That's Yiddish for I'm gonna try. It's
And 6 months, so I called the only lawyer I knew, was a guy who represented my rock stars when they used to get arrested, right? And I had Skid Row and Stone Temple Pilots back then, and they were getting arrested like twice a week. So I had him on speed dial. So I got this guy. He took the case pro bono as a favor, and 6 months later, we ended up in a courtroom in Malone, New York, and I sat there holding the kid's mother's hand when the judge banged the gavel down and reduced the charge from an A1 to an A2 and sent him home. And I said, that was the most profound experience I've ever had, and I'm going to do more of that, right? So I read in Rolling Stone about an organization called Families Against Mandatory Minimums based here in DC. I called them up, joined their board. Then soon after, I learned about the work of the Innocence Project, and on a fateful day, I just marched in there. In those days, you could just walk in there because it was only Peter and Barry in a room with a suitcase, a phone, and a dream. And so I just walked in and said, "I'm your guy, and I'll do whatever you ask me to do, and then I'll do double that." And because I couldn't imagine anything worse than being, sent to prison for a crime you didn't commit, or sentenced to death, as the case I had seen a story about recently. So, I became the first board member there, and I've been there ever since. And since then, I collect boards, I guess, on various everything from the NYU Prison Education Program to the Legal Action Center, and so many other wonderful organizations, Drug Policy Alliance. And my whole thing is ending mass incarceration in all of its forms. And I think we need to go even a step further than what you're talking about. I mean, yeah, we had 300,000 people in prison. We're up 700+% in the last 35 years. I think we need to go below that number because, it's just ridiculous that we pretend that it's a solution to anything, except for the worst of the worst of the worst, people who are actually going to, cause physical harm to their fellow citizens. I understand they can't walk among us, but other than that, there's better solutions. We know that now. There's all this scientific evidence. And me, it's interesting being up here because I'm not a religious person, but as a Jew, I can't stand injustice, and I can't stand it in any form. And this, to me, is the gravest injustice in our society. And so I have an opportunity to do something about it, and that's exactly what I'm going to do for as long as I'm alive.
It's a great story.
That almost makes up for your shitty response before, but not quite. You got me?
Exactly.
We're going to do something together later.
Exactly.
You'll teach me.
Look, you knew you were going to get educated. You knew you were going to get inspired. You didn't know you were going to get shtick. It's the whole thing. So I'll give you a quick précis on my journey. I started out as an assistant U.S. attorney, a line level, entry federal level prosecutor in 1983. And prosecuted all sorts of crimes, including lots of drug cases. And I basically came of age as a federal prosecutor in what we now sort of euphemistically call the drug war, but really was the imposition and the heyday of mandatory minimums and people being locked up without bail and all that sort of stuff. And that was sort of the world in which I existed and grew up. And then I sort of rose through the ranks in my office. But as I did, and as I became a supervisor, thought more and more deeply and carefully about charging decisions and bail decisions and sentencings and pleas and how we were affecting the lives of the people, and not just the people who were going in, but the people who weren't going in, their families and so forth. And one of the things that Sakira said, which I never thought about till much later, is it's basically a policy of most prosecutors and people in law enforcement to separate people, right? Because you want folks who go in, particularly violent folks who go into jail, to separate them from their running buddies. And that means that federal people who get prosecuted in New Jersey could go to jail in Oklahoma. And you know what can't happen if you're in jail in Oklahoma? Nobody can visit you, right? And so what happens is you make it worse in some ways rather than giving people a path back. In any event, in 1994, I went down to Washington and worked for Janet Reno and Jamie Gorelick, who were then running the Department of Justice, and we were really sort of thinking substantively for the first time, I think, about kind of what the criminal justice system should look like. And Janet Reno had been a pretty progressive prosecutor for those days in Miami, and we started to think about that stuff. And then I was in private practice for 12 years after that, trying to convince the government that what I used to think were crimes, I now thought were simple misunderstandings, and learned from the other side really what it was like to have clients, and most of them were not the people we're talking about who were going to jail for simple possession of crack cocaine. They were people who were charged with much more serious stuff, but to be fair, mostly white-collar offenses because they could afford to have somebody like me represent them, and so I still didn't see it close up. But then, in 2009, I was privileged and lucky and fortunate enough to be nominated by President Obama to be the United States Attorney in New Jersey, and my boss was my close friend Eric Holder, and then my boss was my close friend Loretta Lynch, and we spent 8 years as a cadre of very progressive U.S. attorneys thinking about how the criminal justice system really worked. That resulted ultimately in the Attorney General announcing the clemency drive that happened at the end of the Obama administration to drive down numbers. Sakira's boss, Vanita Gupta, who was the head of the Civil Rights Division, and now I think is responsible in large measure for why the Leadership Conference is looking at these issues more closely, woke up one day and realized she was supervising prosecutors in the Department of Justice, and so that mattered to her. There was a huge emphasis on policing. And I along with Vanita, spearheaded the investigation of the Newark Police Department for unconstitutional policing that resulted in a consent decree. And then a lot of U.S. attorneys got very involved in setting up what we call reentry courts or reentry programs for the formerly incarcerated who were coming back to try to get them some of the services that they needed to actually make a successful reentry into society. So we started thinking about these things systemically in a very serious way. But let me change the topic just for a second, a little bit. So how many people in the room watched the Super Bowl? Okay. And how many people saw the commercial about Alice Johnson? Okay, so for those of you who didn't see it, there's a woman named Alice Johnson who was in federal prison for exactly the kind of offense that we've been talking about, a relatively low-level drug offense, in jail for a very long time, and somehow got Kim Kardashian to be her patron. And Kim Kardashian got the President of the United States to grant her clemency and let her out. And there was a commercial during the Super Bowl in which this late middle-aged African-American woman thanks President Trump for his commitment to criminal justice reform and her getting out of jail. Now, there's a lot that's disingenuous about that commercial because her getting out of jail didn't have anything to do with the president's commitment to criminal justice reform. It had everything to do with having a powerful patron who could have access to the president, and that's largely the way clemencies in this administration have happened, which is not good at all. But I guess my question for the panel is this. I remember the George Bush election in 1988, in which the Willie Horton ad was the seminal ad of that campaign, in which an entire country of white people were supposed to be scared to death by the prospect of a black man getting out of jail and killing somebody. That was the message. And that was awful. And I expect, don't get me wrong, I'm not naive. We're going to see that kind of commercial again in this election cycle. But it is interesting to me that there are at least some people who were advising the President of the United States when they made that commercial about Alice Johnson, who think that that criminal justice reform is an issue that can be discussed on the national level and get votes. So the question is that real, or is the president pandering to a particular segment of the population who might see it and think that he's what's the answer to that question?
Well, I would say that it actually is, I would actually say that it's real. And one of the things I think that we've seen, even in this work over the last couple of years around the multi-faith initiative around ending mass incarceration, is that it's actually has an issue, it's an issue that attracts folks across theological lines, political lines. It actually has the opportunity to bring kind of some of the unusual suspects together in ways that we haven't really come together. And so yes, I think there's possibilities, I think, within that. Now, what folks do with that kind of is another thing. But I also think that's also the value that we as faith communities can bring. Like, we can create the container, we can create the spaces for those kinds of conversations, those kinds of alliances to be able to happen. So yes, I think it's actually, that's the hopeful part of this. That's the hopeful part of this. I mean, I think it could have the converse, like increase polarization and increase, the way that folks get used as political footballs, right, during a season like this. But there is hope. There are seeds of hope, I think, in that.
So, Sakira, you're here. Lots of people in your organization interact with lots of other organizations around the country, but also lots of policymakers in other venues in Washington, particularly on the Hill. The act that was passed was called the First Step Act. Mm-hmm. Is there a Second Step Act?
There should be many steps after
Right.
the First Step Act, and for us, I think it's kind of misnamed in that it wasn't the first step, quite frankly. The Fair Sentencing Act was probably the first step that was taken to address mandatory minimum sentences, specifically the crack powder disparity that was alluded to earlier. And so that was actually the first step. And even before that, there was the Second Chance Act, which was to...
which was before the First
Which
Step
was
Act.
before the First Step Act. But it was to provide resources to entities at the state and local level who were trying to help people who were coming back home, who were trying to provide jobs, housing, healthcare, et cetera, to individuals who were coming back home. But I think the First Step Act was significant in that it was thought to be not a bill that was impossible, right? That could not have happened under this administration, and that it's the preceding bills before it under the last administration that sort of paved the way for it went a bit further. This one was a bit less impactful as it could have been. But I think there are many more steps that will need to be taken. We just recently passed the Fair Chance Act, which would require federal contractors and federal employers not to look at a person's arrest or conviction history before they offer them a job or before they evaluate whether or not they can have a job. And that bill was recently signed into law by the president, and that was introduced in 2015. And so there are many pieces of legislation that I think are possible given the climate that we created from the work that has happened over many years, over the last 20 or so years, to bring the issue of mass incarceration to the limelight. I think that what's disingenuous about the ad is that while this administration has let Alice Marie Johnson go, they are, with the other hand, with the Bar Department of Justice and the Sessions Department of Justice, increasing prosecutions of individuals for drug offenses, right? And they have rolled back the clock on many of the reforms that the last administration put in place to address mandatory sentencing, to deal with police violence in communities, et cetera. And so, I mean, it's sort of like a shiny thing over here to distract what's really happening in real time over there. And unfortunately, we were talking about this earlier, that it might, in fact, get some votes of people who are not as educated about what really is happening under this administration. I don't think this president actually really cares about criminal legal reform. I think he cares about himself and getting elected again, quite frankly. And whatever is going to help him get elected, he's going to do, and people are going to guide him to do.
So Jason, you probably travel as much as anybody I know, and you probably speak about these kinds of issues as much as anybody. When you travel and you talk about these kinds of issues and your commitment, do you get a sense that the reception you're getting is different than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Is it only from groups like this that are sort of predisposed, or do you feel like Advocacy General and the organizations in which you are involved and on whose boards you sit are moving the needle in meaningful ways in places not like downtown Washington, D.C. or suburban New York, but in places that are redder?
I'm going to address that in a second, but before I do, I just want to say I'm glad you brought up the war on drugs, because the war on drugs was such a disastrous, terribly failed, disastrous social policy. And we know now the war on drugs only led to more drugs, right? The war on terror created more terrorists, which is why I'm actually going to announce a war on farmers markets. And I'm going to have a booth outside. Anybody that wants to sign up can join me. I think it's going to be a tremendous health thing that we're all going to do. And of course, Willie Horton, it's so crazy. I gave a talk with a Georgetown class that I sponsor. I was part of a Georgetown law class I'm involved with, I should say, in a maximum security prison in Maryland called Jessup. And while I was there, I met Willie Horton. And I was like, holy shit, you're Willie Horton. He's like, oh man, I'm innocent. I'm like, Willie, I think everyone's innocent except you, actually. And you're the guy that screwed it up for everybody. He doesn't seem like a very threatening guy anyway. And and there's nuance to that story as well, but not a great role model in any case. But it was ironic that I ended up actually meeting the guy that really, it's not his fault, but he became the poster child. That horrible poster child because of that racist ad that they ran. That being said, I do feel like we are at a tipping point right now. It's the only sort of semi-bipartisan issue that there is at all, right? I mean, what else do we agree on? I mean, you know, it's like there's nothing to agree with Republicans on. They want to destroy the environment and take away social welfare and do, I mean, basically everything that's horrible is what they stand for. So it's really hard to find anything to agree with them on.
What do you really think?
I think we're facing an existential crisis and we better fucking do something. So, you know, and don't listen to me, listen to Noam Chomsky and others, right? So who says it much stronger than I do. But I feel like, you know, it really is a moment where you have really powerful voices on the right. The I guess you could say they're the libertarian.
Look, the Koch brothers
side,
in particular have been pretty strong on this issue.
Right.
In a lot of ways.
I mean, there's again not a lot else we can agree with them on, but they are on this issue. They are very strong advocates for change. There are a few Republicans like Mike Lee and Grassley and a few others that have been very outspoken on criminal justice reform. I mean, it's amazing. You listen to Mike Lee, I mean, he could get up here and give this talk and it wouldn't sound much different. I mean, he's really progressive on this particular topic. It's remarkable.
He would sound a little less Jewish.
Yeah, it sounded, you know, you do have a point there, right? So we'll teach him a few words and see what happens. But so that's exciting because, you know, having been doing this work for as long as I have, it's nice to see that there's finally recognition. I think the faith community is going to be a key part of this because let's face it, I mean, the evangelicals are, you know, they're a big part of the reason why we're in this situation that we're in Washington right now. Not your congregation, don't get me wrong.
But one of the things also we're seeing is that there's even a split now that's happening in evangelical communities, you know, around age, where younger evangelicals are saying, your issues are not our issues. Right. They're caring about mass incarceration. They're caring about poverty. They're caring about the environment. And so I think there's actually are some openings, you know, even in some more evangelical Christian communities, or even in more conservative Protestant communities.
So let's talk about faith just for a minute, because your organization is called the Multi-Faith Movement to End Mass Incarceration. This has been, it may be happening now every week, but this has been a week where faith has been at the top of the headlines and on at least a couple of mornings. Mitt Romney was quite clear in talking about the fact that he really spent a lot of time thinking about what the right thing to do was, and cited his relationship with God as, he said, God didn't tell me what to do, but I really thought about what it meant to be a person of principle this week. And then the President of the United States had his own response when in response to the person who was leading the prayer breakfast, who was basically saying you should accept those who are your enemies and be nice to them. And the president said he didn't really like what Arthur had to say, but more important, what he said for today, he said, I don't like people who use their faith as justification for doing what they know is wrong, right? And so obviously there's an assumption in there. But I guess the question is, and you just alluded to it, people use faith as a justification, and often legitimately believing it, I think. Some people just use it as a cover, but some people legitimately believe in ending up on both sides of the spectrum on lots of issues. Abortion's probably the one that's the most clear and clearly defined in that way. But I guess the question is, what's the right way? And because this is an organization that is dedicated to relying on its faith as a guiding principle in social justice reform generally, and the topic of this panel is that, the faith voice in the movement. So how do you calibrate that? How do you calibrate it? And recognizing that not everybody agrees with you, even in probably in your own church.
I would say that, you know, I think that the calibration for us really is around love, it's around inclusion. You know, those are really important values and principles in terms of the work that we do and what brings us together. And I think that, no, not everybody is going to agree. But I also think what faith communities can do is provide, oftentimes, we can provide the context, we can provide the places to have conversations that people aren't always going to want to have. Like, even in our congregations, you know, there is diversity of opinion. And so they're in congregations. You've got law enforcement, you've got judges, you've got folks that have been formerly incarcerated. They're there, kind of in our congregations, and so it's important. There's an opportunity for us to be more proactive in creating those contexts and containers for the conversations, for beginning to find ways to begin to work together, knit together this way of kind of new coalitions and way of acting. So I think it really is about love and inclusion, and which as an organizing principle for us.
And so, Sakira, in the leadership conference, you've got lots of organizations that are completely secular, that are your members, and then you've got others that are quite not that. How do you bridge that gap? With this? How do you sell this to people of different faiths? Do you need to do that? Or are people coming at it from different perspectives in that way in your work?
So, I mean, for us, I would say that it hasn't been very difficult to have faith-based organizations that are part of the leadership conference and traditional civil rights organizations to work together for one common goal, which is to end mass incarceration. I mean, I think people come at this issue when we talk about Republicans who have, libertarians or Republicans who have taken up this issue, they are coming at it from different perspectives. Their reasoning sometimes is based in economics, right? They see it as a problem that we have this issue because it affects our budgets, right? And others see it as a problem because it's immoral and there are people who are harmed and hurting. So it hasn't been an issue to bridge the gap is because we have the same common goal. I think though, when you get to policy, right, when you get down to the nitty gritty of it, what is the policy that we should all be pushing for? There are organizations that just haven't had the conversation, right? They haven't actually looked at, should we be for legalization of marijuana and why? Right? And does our faith teach us something that could move us to be there? I think the faith-based voice in this movement has been critical. Jason mentioned Grassley's, commitment to justice. That commitment didn't come without the faith-based organizations. He was vehemently opposed to ending mandatory minimum sentencing. He was vehemently opposed to reforming the criminal legal system until faith-based organizations got together, multi-faith-based organizations, and met with Senator Grassley. And it totally transformed his view on the issue. And so I think it's a critical voice, but they're going to be difficult conversations. They're going to be things that might test your faith might be counter to the policy that we're pushing forward. And I just encourage people to look at ultimately what's the goal that we're trying to achieve? What's the community, what's the society that we want to create for all people, regardless of who they are and how they show up in the world.
So Jason, I'm going to twist the question a little bit for you and make it slightly more personal, if you don't mind.
Judging by the answers I've had so far, I would twist the question.
Exactly. But you're pretty good at shifting it. So in Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Outliers, he actually writes he has a whole chapter at least about your dad. And for those of you who don't know, Jason's dad, Joe Flom, was one of the founders of Skadden Arps, Meagher, Slate, and Flom, one of the preeminent corporate law firms in the world. And he attributes to some large extent, your dad's success with his having grown up as a Jew in the Depression in Brooklyn and what that meant to how he ended up doing what he did and caring about what he cared about. I did watch, over the last couple of days, your speech at the prison in Uganda, which is called Luzira. It's the only, by the way, if you want a little more of Jason Flom's view on all this stuff, it's about 20 minutes, and it's actually it's a TED Talk, effectively, in a Ugandan prison, which shows you where the world has come in terms of new media. And you said two things that struck me in the context of this faith. The first one you said, I'm not a particularly religious person. And then you said, but I've seen too many miracles to stop believing in miracles. And so I'm interested, growing up in the house where you grew up with Yiddish-speaking grandparents like I did, and with your dad, and with those views, how do you see Judaism having affected your work, not so much in the music business, which we totally get, but in this particular part of your life?
I mean, I think that, we grew up very reformed, but, my dad and my mom instilled in us, they gave us when we were little kids $18 to give away on the Jewish holidays, right, to the charities of our choice. And they gave us this idea that we should, and that's what $18 was $18, you know what I'm saying? So I'm a lot older than I look. But, you know, my dad had an extremely defined ethical and moral compass. And he was my hero and my mentor. He devoted his, philanthropic efforts to helping gifted, disadvantaged youth and promoting racial tolerance. So I think his spirit is very much alive here in this room today. And, you know, he taught me to stand up for the underdog and to always try to do what's right. And I passed that on to my kids, of course. He gave us great advice, and he said, do it as far as career goes, you know, because people always ask me why you should become a lawyer, although I'm pretty good at pretending I'm a lawyer, but he says, he said, do whatever you want to do, try to be the best at it, but just make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. And he said that's the only definition of success that matters to him, and therefore I wanted to follow in his footsteps and to honor that legacy. So I think that that's a very Jewish thing. I mean, we do look out for others. And I think that in this particular area, because at the end of the day, the problem is largely economic. And when I say that, mass incarceration is a great business, right? It's an $80 billion business. Mm-hmm. Tons of people are making tons of money. Mm-hmm. It serves as a fantastic lever of social warfare. And and it goes back to Nixon, right? I mean, he didn't want a war on drugs. He wanted a war on blacks and hippies. Mm-hmm. And we know that because Haldeman said so. But we knew it anyway, but now it's actually clear. Mm-hmm. But he couldn't call it that. Mm-hmm. So he manufactured this as a marketing ploy. And at the time, no one cared about drugs. The public didn't care about it. Police departments didn't care about it. That's why they created these incentives for the police departments to go out and make these ridiculous arrests that they didn't want to do. And they gave them the money in order to make them go and do things they didn't want to do, which is to do low-level drug busts. And now now we're facing a new crisis, right? Because now there's a great article in the New Yorker magazine this week, right, about how they're now criminalizing overdoses, right? They're treating overdoses as murder. Mm-hmm. So if you're sharing drugs with somebody, and that person overdoses, they're charging you with murder in more cases than you can imagine. And it's just another level of insanity that we have to be, while we're trying to fix the old problems, we have to watch out for the new problems. So I think as Jews, though, we can lead this effort. I think we have to work with the faith community for sure. But we have to, even one thing we can all do today is go back and look at our portfolios and make sure that we don't have investments in any companies that profit from the caging of our fellow human beings. And I guarantee you some of us do and don't know about it.
So an excellent segue to the last thing I want to do, which is whenever we have an audience like this, and I hope they've all been inspired by the three of you as much as I have, but I want people to walk away with something that they can do, something that they should do, and have us give them some idea about what those things might be. So I think about this sort of through two different frames. One is, if you look at the sort of spectrum of the entire arc of the criminal justice system, yes, Sakira's right, it starts with education and housing and disparities in economic advantage for kids who are 6 months old. But if you then look and what happens to them in school and where do they live, and zip code is really, as we all know, the greatest predictor of economic success and failure. But within the spectrum of the particulars of the criminal justice arc, there's policing, arrest, charging, bail, plea bargaining, sentencing, trials, what happens to people when they're in prison, do they go to prison at all, what happens to them when they get out, all of those, and there are lots of organizations doing spectacular work on all of those kinds of issues. That's one frame. The second frame through which we can look at this is what I'll call sort of the general and the particularistic, or the policy and the boots on the ground. And so this document that you have in your lap that you're handing out, which is the Vision for 2020 for criminal, is a policy document, right? It's a thought piece about ways in which people can look at these various issues. But you look at what Jason is doing, and you look at what the Reverend is doing, and you look at what lots of you are doing, and it's much more granular, right? So in 2 minutes, what would you like people to think about in terms of going back to their Jewish communities across the country and either getting involved in organizing, starting? Couple of quick thoughts on projects or ideas that you think people can be thinking about.
All right, so I want you to go to the website www.endingmassincarceration.com. We have a faith toolkit that we have created that we are pushing out to try to increase the number of faith communities that are doing something in related to ending mass incarceration. So you could do expungements in your state if you can do bailouts. That is, you pool money and you bail people out of jail as a way to draw attention to the way that bail negatively impacts poor people within this country. You can support, there's restorative justice efforts that are actually happening in schools, they're happening in communities. You can advocate for some of these as alternatives within your home community. In terms of instead of sending somebody to prison, that you give somebody maybe the opportunity to do a restorative justice and really advocate for that within your local community. But this toolkit, it's a great piece of work. Encourage you to download it. There's a lot of other different ideas, very concrete things that congregations can do.
Okay, now let's go. How about on the policy side? Because there's bail reform going on in various states, there's legalization of marijuana going on in various states, there's a whole lot of things that are happening around the country. If people want to get involved at sort of a more macro level, in systemic change, as opposed to, and there's room for both. I'm not saying you have to pick one or the other, but what are the options on that end of the spectrum?
I mean, I think that they are not disconnected, right? I mean, what the Reverend is talking about are all pieces of the puzzle that have to be tackled in order to make up the whole, right? So for us to get to the place where we don't have mass incarceration. But I think in your own communities, we don't think about the granular, like, who's your DA? Right? Who do you vote for with respect to who the prosecutor is going to be? What does that prosecutor believe? As a former prosecutor, how are they going to... I was
appointed, not elected, it's fine. Right.
How are they going to think about, though? How are they going to think about charging decisions? How are they going to think about whether they charge people who are with low-level possession, marijuana, et cetera, in their communities? Those are really granular things. How is your police department, right? How does the collective bargaining agreement of your police department impact whether or not they are going to discriminatory police in your community, whether they are going to target people of color? Voting is really, really, really important as it relates to the criminal legal system, because in many places we vote in mayors, we vote in judges, we vote in DAs, we vote in mayors who then appoint police chiefs, right? So we vote in city councils, and all of those folks have a hand in what happens with respect to the criminal legal system, what happens with respect to bail decisions, what happens with respect to sealing and expungement. And so I would say in 2020, we have a lot of people who are up in a lot of different races, and that's really critical, not only for all of the other civil rights issues that we care about, but for this issue in particular. And you can use this document to interrogate people, to say, hey, what do you think about
interrogate
this issue?
them nicely, because we're not in favor of harsh interrogation.
Nicely. But to question, to ask them the questions that you want to know, right? If you agree with something in here around marijuana legalization, you should ask that question at your community meeting when they show up to the town hall that they show up to. And if you need help with questions, please email us, because I have plenty of them.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to say the district attorney's races are so important, and there's so few votes in them generally that you can really make a difference. And a progressive DA changes everything. And now we have some incredible ones: Chisa Boudin in San Francisco, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, and there are others. The change that they are making as we speak in their communities is massive, and that's macro. But you can host an event for the DA, the progressive DA in your area. That will make a huge difference with a relatively small amount of effort. Yeah. So that will be one thing. Of course, like I said, divest in stocks that have anything to do, not just private prisons, but anything to do with prisons. And look at your hiring practices. A lot of you have work at or probably own companies. Let's face it, we're Jews. And but seriously, look at the hiring practices in your companies. Make sure that you don't discriminate against people who have been incarcerated, because many of our companies do. In some cases, there's policies that may be above our heads and we can't do anything about it, but there may be something you can do on that front. And then I would also encourage people to just check out a couple of things. There's a new book out now that I think is a very profound book on the entire problem, which is called Usual Cruelty. And it is basically, it's written on the premise by my personal hero in the entire criminal justice movement, Alikar Katsanis, who's based here, who I had lunch with today, who runs the Civil Rights Corps. And
Co-sponsor of this.
Oh, a co-sponsor of this, yeah. So basically one of his main premises is that the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system is not broken. It's only broken if you believe that it was ever intended to function in a way other than how it does now, which is that a system of racial and social oppression. And that's exactly what it is, and it's working perfectly. It's working, in that sense, more perfectly than any system ever has in the history of not just the Western world, but any part of the world, because we cage more people for longer times per capita than any country has ever done in the history of recorded civilization. So I would encourage you to check out the book, Usual Cruelty. I can send around an essay that the book was based on if the JCPA will allow me. And check out Civil Rights Corps. I think that the work that they're doing on bail reform and the changes that they're making are historic and are affecting tens of thousands of people. It will be hundreds of thousands this year, I think. So I think, look, we're going to win this fight in our lifetimes, but we're going to have to keep the pressure on, and I think the people in this room can have a big role in that. So,
okay, so that's a segue into Evie Litwork. Evie, who is in the front row, is a formerly incarcerated woman who is actually doing something at a very granular level that I think is spectacular. Because I started a what we called a prisoner reentry court in federal court in New Jersey in 2013 for men, almost all men, coming out of federal prison who had no job, no housing, their buddies were all dead or in jail, and the ones who were left were trying to attract them back into the old life. And we knew that if we gave them something constructive, that they could make it. And so we offered them help, as I said, help in housing, education, all that sort of stuff. But Evie has a much more practical and very singular approach to this called the Suitcase Project. So before I introduce Evie, I want to thank the rest of our panel for their extraordinary, inspiring work. And please give your attention to Evie.
I want to thank Melanie Gorlick for inviting me to speak at JCPA's conference. I'm very honored to be here. I am a formerly incarcerated Jewish lesbian and a child of 2 survivors of the Holocaust. And I tell people that because those intersections impacted me while I was in prison. I was incarcerated at age 60. I spent time in 2 federal prisons and solitary confinement. And I was released 5 years ago. And I was released shortly after being in solitary confinement. Now before I get into the Suitcase Project, I want to give you a tiny background. I was, particularly for this audience, I was living with my mother, and I was her caretaker, and the night before I left for prison, she came into my room, all 4'9" of her, with her walker, and said, "I want to talk to you." And I said, okay. She was very serious. And she said, "Prison is going to be harder for you than concentration camp was for me." And I looked at her, I said, "Are you crazy? You were in Auschwitz. How could you compare the two?" And she said, "Well, I was 12 years old, you're 60. And when I was in solitary confinement a couple of years later, I remembered the story. She said, "I was a child. I didn't know what was going on. You had an entire life, and you're going to remember every day of your life while you're inside prison." And that's exactly what happened. So I think a very important and necessary part of this conversation must be reentry, 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 and the human beings like me who are directly impacted by the absolute lack of services that we have. 700,000 people come out of prison every year. I was one of those 700,000 people. I was given $30 in a bus ticket, and I was sent home. And I arrived at Port Authority, a place I had been to a million times before, and I arrived to no one. And in that moment when I arrived to no one, I started sobbing. And I knew that I never wanted anybody to feel the way I felt, the overwhelming feeling of being alone in the world, starting my life over. And so a seminal part of my work is making sure people don't come home alone. So I was homeless, and the Suitcase Project, which I will get to, is guided by my own experience. I was homeless and penniless for 16 months. I understood poverty for the first time when I had to choose on a daily basis whether I was going to eat a 30-cent bagel or a $1 piece of pizza. There are 700,000 people across this country who are released who are thinking about whether to eat that bagel today. There are people that are hungry, and it's 700,000 a year. So there's millions of people out there that desperately need your help. I couldn't find a job. I had 30 years of work experience. I found no job, and I ran into an old friend who was a baby of the women's movement with me. Her name was Evie, and she said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "In prison." And she said, "Where are you living now?" I said, I was living in transitional housing, which, by the way, transitional housing is moving people. If you're living with 150 women in prison, and you come home and you go into transitional housing, which is most of what is available to us, you're just moving us back into another 10 to 100 women living in prison again. And I had to have a curfew. I had to take parenting classes at age 65. And they give you a list of programs which have no bearing on your ability to have any permanency or have any direction in your life. So we've got hundreds of millions of dollars worth of services out there, except transitional housing does nothing to lead to permanent housing. And most of these services, while well-meaning, are a one-stop shop with one-size-fits-all and provides you with a collection of transactional services that do not together help you start a life. You can get a Metro card, a meal, you can get employment training, and the job that they sent me on was to be the head of a construction crew of 16 and 17-year-olds outside in the winter at age 65. So it doesn't work that. This one-size-fits-all have to change, and the focus has to be one person at a time, save one life at a time. Now, my friend Evie found me an apartment, and it was a small senior low-income housing, and I said to her, if I take this apartment, then the only money I have, which is Social Security, will go to rent, and I'll have no money for food. And she said, don't worry, I'll get you a job. 2 more minutes. Am I bad on time here? She couldn't find me a job. So what she did was give me she said, I'm going to give you $1,000 a month for a year. And she was my safety net. So the basis for the Suitcase Project was don't let someone come home alone and provide a safety net for people for at least the first year because we come back damaged. I approached 2 synagogues, CBST and SHA, asked them to raise $2,000 for one person to get them a phone with minutes for a year, a computer, and $600 worth of gift certificates. That's a Metro card for 1 month only, that's food for 1 month only, and clothing. The 3 women who we gave it to were very grateful, but it wasn't enough, and I stopped the project until today I could launch it as a national project. So I'm here to say, and JCPA is a partner in this, I have approached corporations. Lenovo I have no living room anymore because I have hundreds of telephones in it. Corporations are starting to donate products. Eileen Fisher Company wants to give me a lot of clothes, but I need someone to give me a warehouse before I can take them. And in a recent trip in LA, 12 synagogues and organizations said they want to donate to the Suitcase Project. Now try to understand, when we come home, we have nothing. So when it rains outside, we don't have an umbrella. When we do get a new apartment, we can't afford the cleaning supplies. If we do get a headache, $10 is not, we don't have it to get a Tylenol. So I'm asking you to take an interest in your city in raising money for either a series of items or donate, and we will find people in every city and give you their profile, their face, where they are, and you can identify and help one person and save one life. And I can't emphasize it enough. There's a lot of us out there that are lost and struggling, and while all this other stuff is important, I think welcoming home one stranger and saving one life is more important. So thank you for letting me have the time to speak.